Settlers' Ridge existed for people who needed to be somewhere else. The colony world was remote enough that questions about the past were considered poor form, developed enough that survival didn't require heroism, and forgotten enough that most galactic databases listed it with coordinates but no commentary. Ex-Sergeant Ethan Cross had been here 3 years, and that was exactly long enough to convince himself that isolation was preference rather than cowardice. His homestead sat on the southern continent's agricultural band, where the soil was decent if you worked at it, and the nearest neighbor was 6 kilometers away. Perfect distance. Close enough for emergency supplies, far enough to avoid conversations about why someone with his service record was growing vegetables instead of doing literally anything else. The farm produced enough to justify the land claim, and not enough to attract commercial interest. Ethan spent his days repairing equipment that shouldn't break as often as it did, tending crops that probably weren't worth the effort, and maintaining the kind of routine that filled hours without requiring thought. Mornings meant checking irrigation systems. Afternoons meant fixing whatever had broken overnight. Evenings meant sitting on his porch watching moons rise over terrain that didn't care about wars or casualties, or the kind of decisions that still woke him at 3 a.m. He'd stopped expecting surprises. Life on Settlers' Ridge was designed for predictability, for the comfortable monotony of people who'd had enough excitement and preferred boredom. Then the storm hit. Atmospheric discharge lit the sky in shades of purple and electric white, the kind of weather event that made colonists secure equipment and wait it out. Ethan sealed his windows, checked his backup generator, and settled in with ration packs that tasted like regret and food scientists apologizing. The wind picked up, howling through gaps in his homestead's weatherproofing with sounds that almost resembled voices. Someone knocked on his door, not the polite knock of neighbors checking welfare. Heavy, deliberate, the impact of someone who'd walked through a storm and wouldn't be ignored. Ethan's hand found his sidearm before conscious thought engaged, muscle memory from deployments where doors meant threats and unexpected visitors meant combat. He checked the exterior camera feed. The figure on his porch was tall, hunched against the wind, wearing armor that was cracked and scorched and missing pieces. Their posture suggested injury or exhaustion or both. Human colonists didn't wear armor. Human colonists didn't stand in electrical storms looking like they'd walked through several firefights to reach his door. Ethan opened the door with his sidearm held low but ready. The woman standing on his porch was Thackeray. He recognized the species from 3 years of fighting them, from intelligence briefings and combat footage, and the kind of pattern recognition that came from studying enemies until you could predict their tactics. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, with skin that shifted between deep crimson and dark bronze depending on the light. Her features were sharp, angular, with eyes that held both exhaustion and fierce determination. Her armor bore insignia he recognized: command rank, elite units, decorations that suggested extensive combat experience and battlefield success. Then he recognized her face and his blood went cold. Kira Thalrax, the Crimson Blade, she who breaks defenses, commander of the Thackeray Empire's 3rd Conquest Fleet. During the war, her name had been whispered as warning. She'd led campaigns that shattered human defenses, conquered outposts with surgical precision, earned so many titles about inevitable victory that intelligence briefs had a separate section just for tracking her movements. Ethan had never faced her directly, but he'd treated casualties from battles where she'd fought. Had seen what her tactical brilliance looked like in terms of wounded soldiers and defensive positions that shouldn't have fallen but did. Now she stood on his porch, bleeding from fresh wounds layered over old scars, unarmed, her famous armor cracked and failing. She spoke in accented standard, her voice rough with exhaustion. "I need sanctuary. My people hunt me for what I did, for protecting yours." Ethan's sidearm remained pointed at ground level, safety off, his finger resting along the trigger guard in the kind of ready position that could transition to firing in fractions of a second. His brain cataloged threats automatically. She was wounded but still dangerous, unarmed but trained, legendary and standing on his doorstep asking for help. "Why here?" he asked, his voice steady despite his pulse suggesting otherwise. "Why my door?" "Because you're Ethan Cross, ex-sergeant, decorated for holding Garrison Station Zeta against impossible odds. Because your service record shows a pattern of protecting civilians during combat operations. Because I researched every retired human soldier on 17 colony worlds and decided if anyone would understand choosing mercy over orders, it would be you." Lightning lit the sky behind her, casting her shadow across his threshold. The storm howled. She swayed slightly, and Ethan noticed details his initial assessment had missed. The extent of her wounds, the way she held her left side suggesting broken ribs, the burns across her back that looked fresh and painful. She wasn't just wounded. She was nearly broken, held together by determination and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that Ethan recognized from mirrors. "You led the assault on Garrison Zeta," he said. "Not an accusation, just statement of fact. 70% casualties on our side, 3 days of fighting. We held, but barely. I remember. Your unit wouldn't break despite tactical logic suggesting you should. It was." She paused, searching for the word impressive, frustrating, both. "And now you want me to help you." "Now I'm asking for sanctuary because I saved your people, and my people want me dead for it. I'm asking because I have nowhere else to go, and you're someone who might understand that doing the right thing sometimes means losing everything else." The storm hammered his roof. The woman who'd conquered outposts swayed on his porch, bleeding and desperate. Ethan's training screamed warnings about enemies and doorsteps and legends that ended badly, but she'd said she protected humans, saved his people. And if that was true, if the galaxy's most feared warrior had chosen treason over genocide, then leaving her in a storm wasn't just cruel, it was strategically stupid because intelligence alone made her valuable. That's what he told himself, at least. The rationalization that made the next decision feel tactical rather than compassionate. He stepped aside. "Get in. Touch anything except the medical kit, and we'll revisit the sanctuary conversation with significantly less diplomacy." Kira Thalrax, the Crimson Blade, legend made flesh, stepped into his homestead and immediately collapsed against his wall. Up close, her wounds were worse. Plasma burns that hadn't been properly treated, fractures that suggested recent combat, exhaustion that went beyond physical into the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from running too long with too few resources. Ethan closed the door against the storm. His comfortable isolation had just become exponentially more complicated. He guided her to his living room, which suddenly felt too small for a legend. She sat heavily on his couch, the kind of furniture acquired through colony surplus and low expectations. Blood stained his upholstery. He'd worry about that later. "Medical kit is in the kitchen," he said. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't touch anything. And for both our sakes, don't make me regret this." She managed something that might have been a smile. "Your compassion is heartwarming. My compassion is tactical. Your valuable intelligence, possibly an asset, definitely a problem. But you're a problem that's bleeding on my furniture, which means priorities." He retrieved his medical kit, the same one he'd maintained since leaving service, because habits from deployment don't fade just because you plant crops instead of hold positions. The supplies were meant for agricultural accidents, but trauma was trauma regardless of source. Kira's wounds were extensive. Plasma burns across her back and shoulders, fresh, perhaps a day old, consistent with fighting other Thackeray. Her left side showed impact damage suggesting broken ribs, lacerations on her arms and legs that had been hastily sealed but not properly treated. "How long have you been running?" Ethan asked, cleaning burns with Syntheskin gel that probably burned worse than the original injury but prevented infection. 6 months, since I defied High Command's genocide order. since I chose warning human colonies over eliminating them. Ethan's hands paused briefly before continuing treatment. Genocide order. You're claiming the Thackeray Empire ordered extermination. Not claiming, stating fact. The war was ending. We'd lost strategic advantage. High Command decided if we couldn't conquer humanity, we'd eliminate the colonies we'd already identified. Make sure your species couldn't expand into systems we wanted. She winced as he applied pressure to stop bleeding from a laceration. I refused, warned settlements when I could, sabotaged targeting data, gave evacuation windows, saved approximately 6,000 human lives, and earned death sentence from my own people. Ethan processed this while stabilizing her ribs with pneumatic splints. The warrior who'd conquered Garrison Zeta had saved colonies. The legend who earned titles about unstoppable force chose mercy when orders demanded slaughter. Why? He asked. Because genocide is where I draw my line. Because conquest is professional but extermination is moral failure. Because I'm warrior, not executioner, and there's difference even if my people stopped seeing it. She met his eyes, hers showing pain but also fierce certainty. I fought your people, defeated your defenses, earned my titles through combat and tactical superiority. But orders to kill civilians, to eliminate colonies that had surrendered or never fought, that's not war. That's murder wearing uniform. Ethan finished treating her visible wounds. She needed rest, proper medical care, probably surgery for internal damage he couldn't address with agricultural supplies. But she'd live, at least through the night. You researched me, he said. Know why I left service. Mission went wrong. Soldiers died following your orders. You were decorated and discharged honorably. Records say you requested discharge. That command tried to convince you to stay. Records don't say why the mission went wrong. Don't mention that my orders were based on intelligence that was incomplete, that I sent soldiers into situation I didn't fully understand, that people died because I made tactical decision without enough information. He packed away his medical kit. They gave me medals for holding Garrison Zeta, gave me commendations for decisions that got 70% of my unit killed, told me I'd done well, that casualties were acceptable given strategic outcome. I left because acceptable casualties are only acceptable when they're not people you knew. Kira watched him with those amber eyes. You understand then. Choosing what's right even when orders say otherwise. Living with decisions that have cost. I understand your legend who conquered outposts, saved colonies, and is now bleeding on my couch claiming redemption through treason. That's complicated situation, and I'm farmer who came here to avoid complicated situations. Will you turn me in? Ethan considered the question seriously. The woman on his couch was war criminal by any reasonable measure. Also whistleblower, also refugee, also someone who'd apparently saved thousands of human lives at cost of everything she'd built. I'm going to contact my old unit commander, he said finally. Verify your story. If you're lying, if this is elaborate infiltration or intelligence operation, then yes, I'll turn you in with prejudice and creativity. If you're telling truth, then we'll figure out what sanctuary means when legend asks farmer for help. Kira nodded slowly. Fair, more fair than I probably deserve. Probably. But fairness is complicated when the person asking for help also led assault that killed most of my unit. We'll navigate that complexity after I verify you're not elaborate security threat. He set up a bedroll in his living room. She was too injured to move to the spare room, and he wanted her in eyeline anyway. Gave her water, ration bars that tasted like strategic compromise, and painkillers that would help her sleep. Thank you, she said quietly, as exhaustion finally caught up with adrenaline, for not shooting first, for treating wounds, for considering sanctuary instead of immediately refusing. Thank me after we survive whatever comes next, Ethan replied. Because if your people are hunting you and you came here, then my comfortable isolation just became tactical position in conflict. I retired specifically to avoid. But Kira smiled despite pain. Your tactical assessment is correct. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, add it to list of things I'll regret in morning. The storm continued outside, hammering his homestead with wind and rain and atmospheric discharge. Inside, the galaxy's most feared warrior slept on his couch, wounded and vulnerable. And Ethan Cross, ex-sergeant and reluctant farmer, stood watch in the darkness, wondering what kind of sanctuary looked like when legends came knocking. Ethan contacted Major Sarah Reeves through encrypted channels he hadn't used in 3 years. The kind of military backdoor communication that theoretically didn't exist but everyone knew was there. The call took 20 minutes to connect, routing through enough relays to make tracking difficult, before Reeves' face appeared on his aging comm terminal. She looked older. They all looked older. That's what 3 years of civilian life and military service did, aged you differently but thoroughly. Cross, she said, her voice mixing surprise with concern. You're using crisis channels. Either you're in trouble or you're causing it. But possibly both. I need intelligence verification on someone who showed up at my door claiming refugee status. On Settlers Ridge, that backwater colony where you're growing vegetables and avoiding human contact. That's the one. And the someone is Kira Thalrex. Reeves' expression went through rapid transitions, confusion, disbelief, sharp tactical assessment. The Crimson Blade is at your homestead. The warrior who conquered 7 outposts and earned approximately 14 titles about inevitable victory is on your farm. Wounded, unarmed, claiming she defied Thackeray genocide orders and saved human colonies. Asking for sanctuary. I need confirmation before I decide whether I'm helping refugee or harboring war criminal. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Hold for classified verification. The screen went to standby. Ethan waited, watching Kira sleep on his couch. Even wounded and exhausted, she maintained alertness, her hand near improvised weapons, her posture suggesting she could transition to combat despite broken ribs and plasma burns. Reeves returned. Okay, this stays between us, officially doesn't exist, and if anyone asks, you never had this conversation. Understood. Intelligence noticed pattern during war's final months. Human colonies that should have been destroyed received early warnings. Evacuation windows appeared from nowhere. Thackeray targeting data proved inaccurate enough to be deliberate sabotage. We couldn't identify source, but patterns suggested someone high-ranking was interfering with their own military operations. She pulled up classified files. After war ended, Thackeray internal communications mentioned traitor, high-value target who defied high command. Name was redacted, but context suggested senior military officer who chose protecting enemies over following orders. We suspected Kira Thalrex but couldn't confirm. Can you confirm now? Cross-referencing her known movements with pattern of warnings. Reeves worked for several minutes. Yes, high probability she's your source. The warnings correlate with her fleet positions. The sabotage targeting corresponds to systems under her operational control. If she's claiming she saved human colonies, intelligence suggests she's telling truth. Ethan felt something shift in his understanding. The legend was real but complicated. What's her status with human command? Officially, war criminal. She led assaults that caused significant casualties. Unofficially, whistleblower who saved thousands of human lives. We've been trying to figure out how to handle her, prosecute for war crimes, or grant asylum for genocide prevention. It's political nightmare that intelligence community is very carefully not resolving. And now she's on my couch. Yes, which makes this your problem. Reeves leaned forward. One extraction. We can have team there in 6 hours, take her into custody, process asylum claim through proper channels. Ethan looked at Kira. Thought about proper channels, bureaucracy, the kind of attention that would turn his homestead into diplomatic incident. Thought about why he came to Settlers Ridge in first place. No extraction. I'll handle it. Cross, that's spectacularly stupid. She's valuable asset and potential threat. You're retired sergeant with farm and apparently death wish. I'm retired sergeant who took oath about protecting people, and she came asking for sanctuary. I'm going to figure out what that means before I hand her to bureaucrats who'll spend 6 months arguing jurisdiction. Reeves sighed. You always did prioritize idealism over common sense. Fine. But I'm flagging this situation, monitoring your status, and if Thackeray hunters show up at your door, extraction happens whether you want it or not. Noted. Appreciate the verification, Major. Stay alive, Cross. And for what it's worth, if half of what intelligence suggests is true, she earned that sanctuary. Even if she also earned war crimes trial. Sometimes people are both things, and figuring out which matters more is above everyone's pay grade. The call disconnected. Ethan sat in darkness processing. Kira's story was verified. She'd saved thousands of humans, also conquered outposts and caused significant casualties. She was refugee and war criminal, hero and enemy, someone who'd made impossible choice and lost everything for it. Dawn came slowly to Settler's Ridge. Ethan made terrible coffee and passable breakfast, noting that Kira woke before him despite being wounded and exhausted. Warrior habits die hard. She sat up carefully, managing pain without complaint, accepting food and coffee with quiet gratitude. I verified your story, Ethan said. Intelligence confirms pattern of warnings, sabotage targeting, human lives saved. You told truth. Relief flickered across her face. So you'll grant sanctuary. I'll give you safe place to recover. After that, we figure out what sanctuary means long-term. But you need to understand something. This homestead is mine. My rules. Your guest who came asking help, not commander leading campaign. We clear. Clear, thank you. They settled into wary coexistence. Kira healed with speed that suggested Thackeray physiology, had opinions about reasonable recovery times. Within 3 days she was mobile. Within 5 she was helping with maintenance despite Ethan's objections. She approached farm work with same intensity she'd probably approached military operations. Focused, efficient, refusing to accept that injuries should limit capability. Ethan watched her repair water pump with engineering knowledge that translated across species, and realized she wasn't just warrior. She was trained in multiple disciplines, practical competence that made him reconsider assumptions. They talked carefully. Ethan described Garrison Station Zeta, the 3 days of fighting, the casualties that kept mounting, the moment he realized his unit wouldn't break despite tactical logic suggesting they should. Kira listened with professional attention, occasionally asking technical questions about defense configurations. You held longer than projections suggested possible, she said. I recommended pulling back, reassessing approach. High command insisted on immediate assault. They were more concerned with appearance of inevitable victory than actual tactical efficiency. People died for appearance. Yes, on both sides. War is often expensive performance art. For Lee, Kira met his eyes. We're both running from decisions that cost us everything. You chose mercy over staying. I chose preventing genocide over career. We're failures by our respective cultures' standards. Or we're people who drew lines when orders crossed them. Perhaps both. Ethan noticed increased surveillance on the 5th day. Subtle at first, unusual traffic patterns, drones that circled too regularly, the kind of attention that suggested someone was tracking something. He set perimeter alarms, prepared defensive positions, warned Kira that her hunters were closing in. She wasn't surprised. They're thorough, persistent. I expected this. You expected Thackeray hunters to track you to my homestead. Expected hunters to eventually find me. Hoped I'd have more time to recover. Reality rarely cares about preferences. They prepared together, and Ethan discovered they coordinated well. Kira's tactical brilliance combined with his practical knowledge of terrain and defensive positions. They turned his homestead into something approaching fortress. using agricultural equipment as improvised weapons, farming structures as defensive strongpoints. "You're good at this," Kira observed. "Defensive preparation, creative use of available resources. 3 years of deployment teaches you to make positions from whatever's available. Also spite. I survived this long through spite and poor impulse control. Effective combination." The reconnaissance team hit at dawn on the 6th day. 3 Thackeray warriors moving with professional precision, testing defenses without committing to full assault. Ethan engaged from elevated position using hunting rifle that was possibly illegal and definitely effective. Kira fought despite injuries, using improvised weapons with efficiency that bordered on artistic. They repelled the team through combination of tactical preparation and desperate coordination. Afterward, standing in damaged homestead, Ethan reassessed their situation. "That was reconnaissance. They confirmed you're here. Full force comes next." "Yes, probably within 3 days. They'll bring Hunter Squad, 8 to 12 warriors, authorized to retrieve or eliminate traitor. I'm sorry I brought this to your door." Ethan looked at her, legend who'd conquered outposts, saved colonies, now apologizing for tactical situation. "You came asking sanctuary. Sanctuary means protecting people who need help, even when it's complicated, even when it brings trouble. Why? Why risk this for someone who fought against your people? Because you chose right when orders said otherwise. Because you saved thousands of humans at cost of everything you'd built. Because leaving you to die when I can help seems like failure of basic human decency." He paused. "Also because Garrison Station, Zeta taught me that enemies are often just people on different sides of terrible situations. You led assault that killed most of my unit. You also refused genocide orders and saved colonies. Both things are true. I'm choosing to focus on second one while acknowledging first." Kira studied him with amber eyes that held something like gratitude mixed with disbelief. "You're either remarkably principled or catastrophically naive. Probably both. Let's prepare for Hunter Squad and hope principle outlasts stupidity." They spent 3 days turning Ethan's homestead into defensive position that would have made his old tactical instructors either proud or horrified. Kira brought military precision to agricultural chaos, identifying firing lanes through crop rows, reinforcement points in barn structures, fallback positions that use terrain elevation. Ethan contributed intimate knowledge of his property, where ground was soft enough to slow pursuit, which equipment could be weaponized, hidden approaches that only someone who'd walked every meter would know. They worked mostly in silence, coordination improving with each task. Kira would assess a defensive requirement. Ethan would implement it using available materials. When they did speak, conversations were tactical, efficient, the kind of communication that developed between people whose survival depended on mutual understanding. "The main approach from the east is too exposed," Kira said on the 2nd day, studying his property with professional assessment. "Hunter squads will split, half frontal assault to draw attention, half flanking from north where tree line provides cover. North approach has irrigation ditches, deep ones. I can flood them, turn the ground into mud that'll slow movement." "Good. Also set proximity alarms. Hunters move quietly but they're not silent. Early warning gives us tactical advantage." Ethan installed sensors harvested from farm equipment, creating perimeter detection network that was crude but functional. "You've planned for this scenario before." "I've planned for every scenario. Tactical preparation is how you survive when universe actively wants you dead." She paused. "Though usually I plan defensive positions for attacking, not defending. Perspective is different from this side. Welcome to how the other 99% of military operations feel. Inadequate resources, improvised solutions, hope that preparation outlasts opposition." Kira smiled slightly. "Your people are very good at this. Making positions from nothing. Fighting with spite when logic suggests surrender. It's frustrating tactically but admirable philosophically." Spite and poor impulse control got humanity through 3 wars. We're not particularly strong or fast or numerous. We're just really, really stubborn about not dying when someone suggests we should. They reinforced his storage cellar, the one structure built into hillside with natural protection. Stocked it with supplies, weapons, medical equipment. If the homestead fell, the cellar would be final defensive position, the place they'd make their last stand assuming the universe was cruel enough to require one. Question, Ethan said while reinforcing cellar entrance. You researched me specifically, chose my homestead deliberately. Why not approach human military directly, request asylum through official channels? Kira was quiet for a moment, checking weapon. She'd improvised from farming equipment and materials Ethan didn't want to think too hard about. Because official channels mean bureaucracy, committees, political considerations. I'd spend months in custody while governments argued jurisdiction and whether saving humans balanced conquering outposts. That's probably accurate. I chose you because service records suggested you'd understand choosing right over orders. Because holding Garrison Station Zeta meant you knew about impossible positions and desperate defenses. Because living on remote colony suggested you'd value privacy enough to consider sanctuary before immediately contacting authorities. She met his eyes. Also because I was wounded, exhausted, and desperate. I chose you partially through research, and partially because your homestead was reachable and I was running out of options. Sometimes tactical decisions are made from necessity rather than pure strategy. Honest, I appreciate that. Honesty seems appropriate when person is risking life to shelter you. That evening, sitting on his porch watching moons rise, Kira asked about Garrison Station Zeta. Not tactical details but personal ones. What he remembered, how it felt, what stayed with him. Ethan described the 3 days in fragments. The moment supplies ran low. The soldiers who kept fighting despite wounds because retreat meant abandoning position. The decision to hold against recommendations, the casualties that mounted, the extraction that came hours later than promised. 17 soldiers died, he said quietly. 17 people who trusted my tactical assessment, followed my orders, held position because I said it mattered. Command gave me medals, called it acceptable casualties. I've never found way to accept that calculation. But you held, saved the station, prevented Thackeray forces from establishing foothold that would have compromised entire sector. Yes, at cost of 17 lives. Some nights I think strategic victory justified casualties. Other nights I remember their names and wonder if any strategic objective is worth that price. Kira was silent for a long moment. I remember Garrison Zeta from other side. We expected quick victory. Your forces were outnumbered, undersupplied, facing assault from superior position. Every tactical model predicted you'd surrender or fall within hours. What happened? You didn't. Just refused to acknowledge tactical reality. Kept fighting despite logic, despite casualties, despite everything suggesting defeat was inevitable. After first day, High Command demanded I explain why simple outpost assault wasn't concluded. I told them human defenders were either insane or so committed to position that normal tactical assumptions didn't apply. She smiled slightly. They sent reinforcements, ordered immediate assault. I recommended siege approach, wait for supplies to deplete, accept slower victory to minimize casualties. High Command refused, wanted appearance of overwhelming force. So we assaulted, lost more warriors than necessary, and eventually your extraction arrived. We achieved technical victory by forcing you to evacuate, but casualties and time investment made it strategic waste. 17 human soldiers and how many Thackeray? 34 warriors, plus significant equipment losses. High Command called it acceptable. I called it expensive failure that could have been avoided with patience. She paused. Your people died holding position. Mine died taking it for commanders who valued appearance over efficiency. We were both sacrificed for calculations made by people who wouldn't experience consequences. Ethan processed this. The assault that killed his soldiers also killed warriors on other side, all dying for strategic considerations that probably mattered less than anyone admitted. You ever regret it? The campaign, the conquests. I regret casualties that served no purpose beyond demonstrating force. I don't regret fighting. That was my duty, my role. But genocide orders made me reconsider what duty meant. Made me realize that sometimes following orders makes you complicit in moral failures that exceed military justification. So you chose treason. I chose preventing genocide over career advancement. Seems like obvious choice in retrospect, though decision was harder when standing in moment. The hunter squad arrived on the third day, exactly as Kira predicted. 8 warriors in combat armor, moving with professional coordination that suggested extensive training and clear objectives. They announced themselves through long-range communication, formal and cold. Kira Thalrax, you are charged with treason against Thackeray Empire, sabotage of military operations, and collaboration with enemy forces. Surrender immediately and face tribunal. Resistance will result in termination. Kira responded from reinforced position, her voice carrying authority despite being outnumbered and outgunned. I am charged with preventing genocide, with choosing moral integrity over immoral orders. I will not surrender to face execution for doing what was right. The lead hunter's voice held contempt. You betrayed your people, warned enemies, sabotaged legitimate military operations. You are traitor, and traitors face consequences. I warned civilians, prevented massacre of non-combatants. My people's shame is that this is considered betrayal rather than duty. Surrender or die. You have 30 seconds. Ethan positioned himself in elevated firing position, rifle loaded with ammunition that was probably illegal and definitely necessary. She's under my protection, human sanctuary. Leave now or discover how stubborn humans get when defending their property. The hunter squad's leader responded with something between amusement and contempt. Human farmer threatens Thackeray hunter squad. Your courage is admirable. Your tactical assessment is poor. Yeah, I get that a lot, usually from people who underestimate spite as tactical advantage. The assault began with professional precision. 4 hunters frontal, 4 flanking north exactly as Kira predicted. Ethan engaged from elevated position, firing calculated shots that prioritize suppression over kills, make them careful, slow their advance, buy time. Kira fought from ground level despite injuries, using improvised weapons and environmental advantages with efficiency that was genuinely impressive. The irrigation ditches Ethan flooded slowed the flanking team. Proximity alarms gave warning before they reached cover. Defensive positions turned agricultural structures into strongpoints that required clearing rather than bypassing. But 8 professional warriors against 2 defenders, 1 wounded, 1 civilian, was mathematics that didn't favor survival. They fell back to secondary positions after 20 minutes. The homestead's main structures were compromised. Equipment was damaged. Ethan took shrapnel to his shoulder, minor but bleeding. Kira's old injuries reopened from exertion and combat stress. Cellar, Ethan said between covering fire. Final position. We hold there or we don't hold at all. They retreated to reinforced storage cellar, sealing entrance behind them. The structure was built into hillside, natural protection above, reinforced walls on sides, single entrance that became defensive chokepoint. Cramped, dark, probably their tomb if hunter squad decided patience was optional. The assault on cellar entrance was methodical. Hunters didn't rush. They'd learned that rushing against desperate defenders resulted in casualties. They used plasma charges to weaken entrance, established firing positions, prepared for final assault. In the darkness, waiting for inevitable breach, Kira spoke quietly. I didn't come here randomly. I researched you. Ethan Cross, ex-sergeant, decorated for holding Garrison Station Zeta, known for protecting civilians during combat operations. I came here because I thought if anyone would understand choosing mercy over orders, it would be you. Ethan reloaded his rifle in darkness, hands steady despite circumstances. So this was calculated, strategic choice based on psychological assessment. Yes, also desperate hope that someone would help. I'm tactical planner, not idealist, but sometimes tactics require trusting that people are better than statistics suggest. You manipulated me. I chose you deliberately based on service record and psychological profile. If that's manipulation, then yes. I manipulated you into considering sanctuary instead of immediately shooting war criminal who appeared on your doorstep. Ethan laughed despite circumstances, short, sharp, slightly unhinged. You know what? Fair. I'd have done same thing in your position. Research target, assess probability of cooperation, make strategic approach rather than random appeal. It's good tactics even if it's ethically questionable. Does it change your decision, knowing I chose you deliberately? No, because regardless of manipulation, you still saved thousands of humans, still chose treason over genocide, still came asking for help when you were wounded and desperate. The calculation might have been tactical, but the need was real. The cellar entrance exploded inward. Hunters breached with professional efficiency, flash suppressors, coordinated entry, weapons trained on defensive positions. Ethan and Kira fought back with everything they had left, which was training and spite and zero interest in surrender. The firefight in enclosed space was brutal, chaotic, the kind of close combat where survival was measured in fractions of seconds. Ethan's rifle ran dry. He transitioned to sidearm. Kira fought hand-to-hand despite broken ribs, using combat techniques that turned Hunter's coordination against them in confined space. Then the lead hunter, massive warrior in command armor, had Kira pinned, weapon to her head, demand for final surrender. She refused, stated clearly that she'd make same choice again, that genocide orders deserved defiance. The hunter prepared to execute her, and Ethan made choice that was probably his stupidest yet. He stepped between them. Unarmed human farmer standing between Thackeray warriors, declaring that sanctuary meant something, and he wasn't letting them execute someone who chose mercy during genocide. It was spectacularly stupid, possibly suicidal, also apparently effective, because Major Reeves chose that exact moment to arrive with human military response team that had been monitoring situation since Ethan's initial contact. Turns out commanders don't trust retired sergeants to handle diplomatic incidents alone. Reeves had positioned quick reaction force on planet, ready to intervene if situation deteriorated. Situation had very much deteriorated. The extraction was professional, overwhelming, the kind of military response that made arguments about sovereignty and jurisdiction feel academic. Thackeray hunters were detained. Kira was taken into protective custody. Ethan's homestead was secured as diplomatic incident site, and Ethan's comfortable isolation was officially, comprehensively shattered. The aftermath of firefights was always worse than the firefights themselves. Adrenaline faded, injuries made themselves known, and questions about decisions made under pressure required answers that felt inadequate when delivered from hospital beds. Ethan woke in human military medical facility, his shoulder properly treated, his homestead categorized as diplomatic incident site requiring extensive documentation, and Major Reeves sitting beside his bed with expression suggesting she had opinions about his life choices. "Cross," she said, "you're either the bravest idiot I've ever commanded or the dumbest one. Intelligence community is still debating. How's Kira?" "Alive, in protective custody. Facing asylum hearings, war crimes investigations, and approximately 40 different bureaucratic processes that I don't understand and don't want to. She's asking to see you, which is causing its own diplomatic complications." "Let me see her." "You're not cleared for, Reeves. Let me see her. I just fought 8 Thackeray warriors to protect her. Least you can do is allow conversation before bureaucracy swallows us both." Reeves sighed. "You always did prioritize idealism over regulations." "Fine. 20 minutes, supervised, and if she makes any threatening movements, my guards will demonstrate why threatening movements around injured soldiers is poor choice." They arranged meeting in secure room that was technically neutral space and practically interrogation chamber with better lighting. Kira arrived flanked by guards, still healing but mobile, wearing civilian clothes that looked wrong on someone who'd probably spent most of life in armor. The guards positioned themselves at respectful distance. Reeves observed from monitoring station, probably recording everything for reports that would be classified and ignored simultaneously. "You stepped between me and execution," Kira said without preamble. "Unarmed, against Hunter squad leader. That was tactically insane." "Yeah, I've been informed, multiple times, by people using increasingly creative profanity." "Why?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "Because sanctuary means something. Because you saved thousands of humans at cost of everything you built. Because leaving you to die when I could help felt like failure of basic principles I try to live by even when they're inconvenient." He paused. "Also because I'm apparently very bad at risk assessment and default to spite when faced with impossible situations." Kira smiled, genuine expression that transformed her features from stern warrior to someone carrying weight but not crushed by it. "You risked life for legend who conquered outposts and caused casualties. Most humans would have let Hunter execute traitor. Most humans didn't spend 3 days fighting beside you. Didn't watch you refuse to surrender despite knowing execution was coming. Didn't hear you state clearly that you'd make same choice again, that genocide orders deserved defiance." Ethan met her eyes. "You're war criminal. Also refugee. Also someone who chose right when orders demanded wrong. I'm choosing to shelter refugee part while acknowledging war criminal part exists. Maybe that's naive. Maybe I'll regret it when bureaucracy finishes processing. But right now it feels like right choice. Human command will argue I should face trial for war crimes, conquest, casualties caused during military operations. Probably. They'll also argue you saved thousands of lives by preventing genocide. Intelligence says you warned colonies, sabotaged targeting, gave evacuation windows. Both things are true. Question is which one matters more." Kira was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think matters more?" "I think people are complicated. You led assaults, also prevented massacres. You conquered territory, also saved civilians. Trying to reduce you to just war criminal or just hero seems like failing to understand that people contain contradictions." He shrugged despite shoulder injury protesting movement. "What I think doesn't matter much. Asylum hearings will decide your status. Courts will determine if war crimes prosecution is appropriate. I'm just retired sergeant who gave you sanctuary when you asked and fought beside you when hunters came. You're person who risked everything for someone you'd fought against. That's not just anything. That's remarkable choice that I don't fully understand." "Yeah, well, add it to list of things we're both trying to figure out." The asylum hearings took 6 months. Bureaucratic nightmare of testimony, evidence review, political considerations about precedent and consequences. Kira faced questioning from military tribunals, intelligence committees, and diplomatic corps representatives, who all had opinions about appropriate balance between justice and pragmatism. Ethan testified about her arrival, her wounds, her story about preventing genocide. Provided tactical assessment of defense against Hunter squad. Explained his decision to grant sanctuary in terms that avoided discussing how much of that decision was principle versus just not wanting to let someone die on his doorstep. Intelligence confirmed the pattern of warnings, the colonies that survived because someone high-ranking sabotaged targeting. Verified that Kira Thalrax had been charged with treason by Thackeray Empire for protecting enemies. documented approximately 6,000 human lives saved through her defiance. Military prosecutors argued that saving lives didn't erase conquests, that war crimes had been committed regardless of later redemption. Defense countered that preventing genocide demonstrated moral courage that exceeded legal categories, that prosecuting someone who chose protecting civilians over following orders sent terrible message. The debates were philosophical, legal, political, and ultimately above Ethan's pay grade. He returned to Settlers Ridge while bureaucracy processed, repaired his homestead, tried to resume farming like 3-day firefight hadn't happened. The decision came through on day 183. Asylum granted with conditions. Kira could not return to Thackeray space, must report to human authorities regularly, essentially became permanent refugee with provisional legal status. War crimes prosecution was deferred, not dismissed, but postponed pending review of precedents and international law considerations that would probably take decades to resolve. She was free, technically, also permanently exiled, also carrying legal status that was complicated enough to require lawyers just to explain. Reeves contacted Ethan the day after decision. She's asking to return to Settlers Ridge, to your homestead specifically. Command wants to know if you'll accept. Ethan looked at his repaired farm, his comfortable isolation that had been comprehensively shattered anyway. Why me? Why not relocation to settlement with better support infrastructure? Because apparently you're person she trusts. Because sanctuary extended once creates obligations neither of you can quite define. Because she's refugee without homeland and you're veteran without comfortable answers, and maybe you'll figure out what that means together. That's terrible reasoning that will definitely cause more diplomatic complications. Yes. Do you accept? Ethan thought about the warrior who'd conquered outposts and saved colonies, about choosing mercy when orders demanded otherwise, about sanctuary meaning something beyond temporary shelter. Yeah, I accept. Tell her she's welcome. Also that agricultural maintenance is mandatory and I'm not running refugee retreat. She wants to stay, she works. Kira arrived 3 days later, carrying single bag with possessions that probably couldn't fill small closet. She stood on his repaired porch, looking less like legend and more like someone who'd lost everything and was trying to figure out what came next. Thank you, she said, for sanctuary, for defense, for testifying during hearings, for giving me place when I have nowhere else. Thank you for saving 6,000 humans and choosing treason over genocide. We're probably even, or at least even enough to try this. Try what? Figuring out what happens when legend becomes farmer, when warrior becomes refugee, when former enemies decide sanctuary means something more than temporary alliance. They settled into patterns that felt like building something new from broken pieces. Kira approached agricultural work with intensity she'd probably applied to military campaigns, systematic, efficient, refusing to accept that tasks should be difficult. Ethan watched her repair irrigation systems and realized she was genuinely skilled at maintenance, engineering knowledge translating across species and purposes. They worked mostly in companionable silence, coordination that had developed during defensive preparation now applied to farming. When they talked, conversations ranged across topics that felt safe: crop yields, equipment maintenance, weather patterns that affected planting schedules. Sometimes they discussed war carefully. Ethan would mention Garrison Station Zeta. Kira would provide tactical perspective from other side. She'd describe conquest campaigns. He'd ask about decisions made, casualties considered, moments where choices felt impossible. Do you regret conquering outposts? He asked one evening while repairing fence line that had been damaged during firefight. I regret following orders without questioning them. I don't regret fighting, that was my duty, but I regret not drawing lines sooner. Not questioning objectives, not recognizing that conquest can become excuse for atrocities if nobody asks whether territories should be conquered at all. She paused. You regret Garrison Station Zeta. I regret 17 casualties. Don't regret holding position that saved lives, prevented tactical disaster, but casualties stay with you regardless of strategic justification. We both carry weights from war, decisions made, consequences that can't be undone. Question is whether we let that weight crush us or use it as foundation for something better. That's surprisingly philosophical for someone who spent career conquering systems. Warriors have time to think between battles. Occupational hazard of profession that involves significant waiting between moments of violence. They defended each other, not from physical threats, though both remained alert for Thackeray hunters who might ignore diplomatic asylum, but from isolation and silence and weight of carrying too much alone. Kira helped Ethan process his service-related nightmares through tactical discussion that made 3 a.m. thoughts feel less overwhelming. Ethan provided sanctuary in practical sense, place where being refugee didn't mean being constantly questioned or judged. Months passed. Agricultural cycles continued. They built routine that felt like peace, fragile but genuine. Settlers started visiting, curious about legend living on Ethan's farm, wanting to meet Crimson Blade who'd become refugee. Kira handled attention with grace, answering questions about Thackeray culture and military service, while carefully avoiding details that might be classified. But you also saved lives, protected colonies. She paused. I don't forgive you, but I won't demand you leave. Perhaps that's close enough to peace. Kira bowed slightly, Thackeray gesture of respect. That's more grace than I deserve. Thank you. Late one evening, sitting on porch watching moons rise, Kira asked questions she'd been avoiding. Why did you really grant sanctuary? Truth, not tactical explanation. Ethan considered this. Because you knocked on my door during storm, wounded and desperate, asking for help. Because my oath about protecting people doesn't have exemptions for former enemies. Because leaving someone to die when I could help seemed like failure of basic principles. He paused. Also because I recognized myself in you. Someone who'd made impossible choices, lived with consequences, came to remote colony trying to figure out who they were when war ended. You were legend, but you were also just person asking for help. Seemed like helping was right choice. Even though I led assault that killed most of your unit. Even though. Because holding grudges about military operations seems exhausting when person who led those operations also saved thousands of human lives. You're complicated. I'm complicated. Situation is complicated. But sanctuary is simple. Someone asks for help, you provide it if you can. Kira was quiet for a long time. I came here because research suggested you'd understand. I stayed because you proved understanding was real. Thank you for sanctuary, for defense, for treating legend like person who needed help rather than symbol of complicated past. Thank you for choosing treason over genocide, for saving colonies, for approaching farming with same intensity you probably applied to military campaigns, which is entertaining even when it's unnecessary. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars wheel overhead. Two former enemies building something new, not quite friendship, not exactly alliance, something stranger and more genuine. Peace built not on forgetting the past but on choosing different futures. The galaxy's most feared warrior had become refugee farmer. The retired sergeant had learned that isolation wasn't sustainable when legends knocked asking sanctuary. And between them, they proved that redemption looked like agricultural maintenance, shared silence, and choosing to help when refusing would have been easier. Settlers' Ridge continued existing for people who needed to be somewhere else. But now it also existed for people learning that elsewhere could become home if you found the right person willing to share doorstep during storms. Ethan's comfortable isolation was gone, comprehensively shattered by warrior seeking sanctuary. But what replaced it? Partnership with someone who understood carrying weight, building peace from war's aftermath, choosing mercy when bitterness would have been justified, felt like improvement even when it was complicated. Some nights Kira still woke with nightmares about genocide orders, about choosing treason, about losing everything she'd built. Some nights Ethan still processed Garrison Station Zeta, 17 names that wouldn't fade, decisions made under pressure that stayed long after pressure passed. But they weren't alone. They had sanctuary, literal and philosophical, had person who understood that sometimes doing right meant losing everything else, had shared space where former enemies could become something better than simple categories like friend or ally or anything else that felt inadequate for complicated reality. The most feared alien warrior in Galaxy had arrived at Ethan's door for unbelievable reason. She needed help. He could provide it. And sometimes that simple calculation mattered more than history or war or complicated politics. They built peace from that foundation. One day at a time, one repair at a time, one shared silence at a time. It wasn't the retirement Ethan had planned.